Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 7.3, at least the first part of Lecture 7.3, on rules of validity for categorical syllogisms. I'm breaking these rules of validity into two parts because I have found that there's just too much to get through in one lecture. So, future editions of the book will probably break these into separate parts, but I'm going to handle it by just breaking 7.3 into part 1 and part 2 for purposes of this lecture series. And today is part 1, rules which I'm going to subdivide and call the terminological rules of validity. I'll begin, as usual, with a recap of where we've been up to this point. Then we'll talk about the general topic of validity and how it relates to the form of the syllogism. Again, emphasizing that what we're doing here is talking about form and a matter of form. It's why we're talking about snarks and boojums and jabberwocks so much. Then we'll talk about the rules of validity in general, because there's something to be said about that. They've occupied a very prominent place in the tradition, and yet we're not really quite sure what all the rules are. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to cover the first 3 rules, which, once we've done the rest, should be pretty easy. The rule number 1, 3 terms, each used twice. Rule number 2, the middle term distributed at least once. And rule number 3, no upgrades in the conclusion. That's kind of a shorthand description of rule number 3. I'll give you a more complete description when we get there. And then we'll work some examples toward the end to see how we detect violations of these rules when we look at real syllogisms. All right, so let's get going with our recap. We make inferences to extend our knowledge. We try to extend our knowledge from some things that we know to answer some questions about things that we don't know, or maybe we suspect them but we haven't proven them and we want to prove them. The type of deductive argument that we are making in this chapter in order to accomplish this is the syllogism. Syllogisms are 3-line arguments in which a conclusion purports to follow from a major premise and a minor premise. The major premise contains the major term. What's the major term? The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The minor premise contains the minor term. How do we know what the minor term is? It's the subject of the conclusion. So we find the conclusion, we find the predicate, that's the major term, we find the subject, that's the minor term, and we identify the premises according to which of those 2 terms they contain. Each premise also contains a middle term. The middle term is neither major nor minor, but the middle term serves as the measure, so to speak, of the other 2 terms. So the fundamental strategy of the categorical syllogism is to relate the major term to the minor term, affirmatively or negatively, by relating each of them to some middle term. Okay, that's our recap. Now let's talk about validity and form. So let's go back to the beginning. We know that a sound argument requires clear terms, true premises, and valid inferences. What are the only 3 things that can ever be wrong with a deductive argument? It can have unclear terms, it can have false premises, or it can have invalid inferences. But if the terms are clear and the premises are true and the inferences are valid, then that argument is sound. Soundness requires all of those things. So we're now in the 3rd act of the mind, and that means that we're focusing in on validity. Clarity and truth both depend on the matter or substance of the argument. We can't decide clarity or truth when we're dealing with snarks and boojums, at least not in the premises. We can deal with it with the validity of the inferences, but we can't really do much with that because they're imaginary. Validity, however, depends entirely on form. Entirely on form. So, for example, I can analyze this syllogism. All snarks are boojums. No jabberwocks are boojums. Therefore, no jabberwocks are snarks. And I have claimed in previous lectures to know that this conclusion follows from these 2 premises. But how could I possibly know that if all the terms are imaginary? Well, I know that because I can mark up the syllogism according to its form. I can say, okay, well, where's my conclusion? My conclusion is no jabberwocks or snarks. The predicate of that conclusion is snarks. I'm going to mark that with a P both times that it appears. There's my major term. And then I can look for the minor term because that's going to be the subject of my conclusion. The minor term is jabberwocks, and I'll mark that with an S each time that it appears. And then what's left? What's left is boojums. I can mark that with an M for my middle term. And now what do I know here? Well, I know that because of the rules that we're going to study later today, I know that this form is always going to be valid. If I have anything, if it doesn't matter whether it's snarks, boojums, anything else, if I put anything into this form, all P are M, no S are M, therefore no S are P, that will always be a valid argument. For example, I can say all elves are immortal, no men are immortal, therefore no men are elves. And I can know that that's true if the premises are true, not because I've read Tolkien. Indeed, nothing about this says that I'm in Tolkien's universe. It's not an empirical comparison with the real world. It's simply a matter of the form. Any argument of this form holds, that is, it has a valid inference, provided the premises are true. And of course, what's represented in every syllogism is that the premises are true. How about this one? All dogs are animals, all cats are animals, therefore all cats are dogs. That doesn't seem right. What's going wrong there? Well, interestingly, we have the P and the M and the S all in the same place. If you compare the first argument with the second argument, when we reduce this to its form, it looks like it's all the same. The only difference is that in the second premise, the first argument has a negative, no S or M, and the second argument has an affirmative, all S are M. And that turns out to make all the difference, because it makes a difference in how the middle term functions, for reasons that we'll get to in just a moment when we're going through rule number 2. So again, the first argument is absolutely valid, and any argument of that form will be valid. The second argument, which we know, because we know what dogs and cats and animals are like, we know that argument, there's something wrong with that. And indeed, what's wrong with that is something wrong in the form, and any argument in that form will also be invalid, even if it happens to have a true conclusion. In fact, we should make this point very clearly. Even if all three propositions are true, that is, even if both premises are true and the conclusion is true, the inference from the premises to the conclusion is invalid unless the argument has a valid form. Because the whole point of formal logic is not to need to check the universe to see if it's right. The whole point of formal logic is to bypass any need for empirical confirmation. It's to take what you already know through your sense experience or through maybe your reasoning out from other conclusions and extend it further, right? So that is why we are doing formal logic and limiting our consideration of validity to matters of form. All right, now what about these rules of validity? Well, all the way back to Aristotle, he was the first one to come up with these rules. What are the rules of validity? Everyone who writes about this has recognized that there are just a few rules of form, and if you apply those rules, you will know whether any syllogism is valid or not. Unfortunately, there is no consensus on how many rules there are. It may be a little bit surprising how freely people have differed from Aristotle on the number of rules, but I've seen as few as 4, and I've seen as many as 9. Should that bother us? Not really. If you think about it, I could state the rules of validity in one rule. All syllogisms are valid if the conclusion must follow when the premises are true. That's one rule. It's easy to remember. It's not so easy to apply. It's actually kind of useless. So I can get it down to one rule, but it's one useless rule. Even though it's true, it's useless. On the other hand, I could also write a whole bunch of rules. 9 is a lot, but I could write even more than 9. I could get very particular about where each term must be and what the quality of each proposition must be. And then I would have so many rules that you would never remember them all, right? That would also be not very useful. So when we decide how many rules we're going to have and how we express them, we're making a prudential judgment, a practical judgment about what is the right amount to carry in your head. And I sort of took a look at how various people divided this up, and I settled on 5 rules. And I'm going to divide the 5 rules into 2 groups. 3 terminological rules. And I call them terminological rules because they focus on the terms of the syllogism and the distribution of those terms. Right? So the first 3 rules that we're going to cover in this first lecture, this first part 1 of section 7.3, are going to be about the terminological rules. And then there's going to be a second kind. 2 rules that I'll call qualitative rules because they focus on the quality, that is, whether it's affirmative or negative, of each of the propositions, each of the premises, and the conclusion of the syllogism. And then in part 2, I'm also going to teach 2 handy corollaries for syllogisms that contain particular propositions, that is, I and O propositions. And because they're corollaries, that means you don't need them. You would reach the same conclusion even if you didn't have them, but they're very quick to apply when you have a syllogism that has particular propositions. And that makes them kind of useful, even though they're not strictly necessary as corollaries. Now, one thing I want to emphasize before we go on is that there are 256 possible forms of the categorical syllogism. And the fact that people don't agree on how many rules there are is absolutely not the same thing as saying that people disagree about the validity of any of these syllogisms. There's no disagreement on the 256. Absolutely everybody who writes about logic would agree on each one of those 256 syllogisms, whether it is or is not a valid syllogism. It's only really the practical question of how to frame these rules that has sparked disagreement among logicians. So, on to Rule 1. Rule 1 is that each valid syllogism must have 3 terms, each used twice. Now, I almost left this one out, right? By definition, syllogisms all contain 3 categorical propositions. And that means there's going to be 6 terms, right? Each categorical proposition has a subject and a predicate. So we're going to have, by definition, 3 subjects and 3 predicates. But what's added by this rule is that unless those 3 subjects and 3 predicates, or 6 terms, fall into 3 pairs, then the fundamental strategy of the syllogism, which is built around the middle term, must fail. That is, unless they're in 3 pairs, you're not going to be able to compare S to P by comparing each of them to M. Instead, you're going to get something that looks like this. You'll compare one S to something that's M-like, and you'll compare one P to something that's M-like, and notice that what you have is you still have that gap of uncertainty in the middle. Unless you compare them each to the same middle term, then you will not be able to bridge the gap of uncertainty. So, every valid syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice. What would it look like in practice if we didn't have that? Well, you might get something like this. All squares are 2-dimensional. All cubes are 3-dimensional. Therefore, no cubes are squares. Is that valid or invalid? Well, let's just pause and note that the first premise is true, the second premise is true, and the third premise is true. And the whole syllogism looks like a pretty good argument, right? I mean, it all kind of makes sense. But it makes sense because you are supplying an additional syllogism, an additional premise that says that 2-dimensional things are not 3-dimensional things. What you have here is 4 terms. And violations of this rule are often called the fallacy of 4 terms. Because when we compare squares to 2-dimensional things and cubes to 3-dimensional things, it is another step of reasoning to know that 2-dimensional things are not 3-dimensional things. It's not a hard step of reasoning. It's obvious to you. But sometimes people make assumptions about things like that, and the assumptions turn out to be wrong. This is how we identify exactly what logical link we need to shore up, right? Sometimes when we wonder where our reasoning has gone wrong or where the mistake is, we see that we've been a little too quick to equate 2 things that maybe aren't exactly the same thing. That is another service that we get from paying close attention to the form of our arguments. So if I have four terms, that's one way to violate this rule. The other way is often called the fallacy of the ambiguous middle. You may remember that a long time ago I used an example for an ambiguous term. I said something like, all pigs live in pens, all pens are tubes filled with ink, therefore all pigs live in tubes filled with ink. And we all said, that's an equivocal use of pens. Well, it really doesn't work as a syllogism, because with the equivocal use of pens there identifies two different concepts. And because in logic we're more interested in the meaning of the term than we are in the term itself, we're interested in the concept and not the term, what we've really got there is four terms. Pens is one term, one idea, when it refers to habitations for pigs, and it's a totally different term and a totally different idea when it refers to tubes filled with ink or writing instruments. And so that is an example where we have four terms, even though the words used for the two middle terms seems to be the same. So we would call that the fallacy of the ambiguous middle, the middle term that really means two things. And that is a very common fallacy. You often will find people who are using, and often they're searching for that one word that can be used ambiguously in order to make the argument close. They're aware of the problem, and you have to be alert to it so that you can find how they're using that term and say, I'm going to call you out on that one. That's not the same thing. You used that word twice, and it didn't mean the same thing each time that you used it. So this is really a very, very important rule in the back and forth of real life arguments, because we often find people not so much using four terms, but really using ambiguous middle terms so that there are four concepts in place, even though there are only three terms for those concepts. Okay, what is our second rule? Rule 2 is that the middle term must be distributed at least once. That is, once we have three pairs of terms, we need to make sure that they're compared properly, and that turns out to depend on distribution. Remember distribution? This is something from chapter 5 that popped up again in chapter 6, but it really comes to the fore here in chapter 7. Unless the middle term is distributed at least once in the premises, then the inferiors to which the subject is compared might not include the inferiors to which the predicate is compared. That is, your subject and predicate, though compared to the same concept, might be compared to different inferiors of that concept, and that will turn out to be a problem. The examples will help make this a little clearer. So here it is with imaginary creatures. All woozles are imaginary. All heffalumps are imaginary. Therefore, all heffalumps are woozles. Now, we can't know whether all heffalumps are woozles or not, but I can tell you for sure, based on the form of this syllogism, that this syllogism definitely does not prove that all heffalumps are woozles. This syllogism is invalid, because if it were valid, I would have to accept this syllogism, which is exactly the same in form. All dogs are animals. All cats are animals. Therefore, all cats are dogs. I know that's wrong. So let's figure out what the problem is. Well, if I go to my conclusion, all cats are dogs, I find dogs is going to be my major term. So I'll give that a P, both places. Cats is going to be my minor term. It's the subject of the conclusion. So I give that an S both places. And then what's my middle term? My middle term is animals. Okay. When I say all dogs are animals, is that middle term distributed or undistributed? It's the predicate of an A proposition. The predicate of an A proposition is undistributed. Okay, well, when I say all cats are animals, is animals distributed or undistributed? Again, the predicate of an A proposition is undistributed. What's happening in real life is that I'm comparing cats to some animals, and I'm comparing dogs to different animals. And because in neither case am I getting to the entire extension of animals, that is, both of them are undistributed rather than distributed, that makes it possible for both of those subsets of animals to coexist in there and yet not overlap in any way. So the conclusion that all cats are dogs turns out to be wrong. I can't even say that some cats are dogs. I can't say anything like that because at no point have I made sure that the middle term is fully distributed. The undistributed middle is what this fallacy is called. The fallacy of the undistributed middle is when you have a middle term that is not distributed at least once. It doesn't have to be distributed both times, but it does have to be distributed at least once. Okay, rule 3. Rule 3 is the no upgrades rule, but no upgrades is just a shorthand way of remembering the rule. What the actual rule is that any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. Why? Well, it has to be distributed in the premises because otherwise you wind up saying more in your conclusion than your premises justify. Let's look at an example. All dogs are animals, no cats are dogs, therefore no cats are animals. Now again, because this is not imaginary creatures, we know that this must be wrong. But why is it wrong? Let's figure it out. Does our conclusion tell us about all cats or only some cats? No cats are animals. Well, the conclusion, it tells us about all cats. It tells us that all of them are non-animals, right? So the subject term of the conclusion is distributed. Does it tell us about all animals or only some animals? Well, it tells us about all animals. All the animals are non-cats. So the predicate term is also distributed in the E proposition. So in our conclusion, both cats and animals are distributed. Now let's look at the premises. Do our premises tell us about all cats or only some cats? We have no cats or dogs. Well, that's a universal proposition, and the subject of a universal proposition, an E proposition, that's distributed. So it tells us about all cats. Does it tell us about all or only some animals? Well, that's up in the major premise. All dogs are animals, and the predicate of the A proposition is undistributed. The predicate of the A proposition is affirmative, so the A proposition is affirmative, and the predicate's undistributed. So it only tells us about some animals. In other words, what happened here is animals got an upgrade from the premises to the conclusion. No upgrades. If you've got a term that is distributed in the premises or in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premises, or else that's unjustified. No, neither the major nor the minor term, if it's distributed in the conclusion, neither one of those is valid if you're drawing it from something that was undistributed up in the premises. Now, am I saying that what happens if it's distributed in the premises but undistributed in the conclusion? That's totally fine. What if it's undistributed both places? That's totally fine. What if it's distributed both places? That's totally fine. The only time that you have a problem under Rule 3 is when you have an upgrade. That is, you've gone from undistributed in the premises to distributed in the conclusion for either the major or the minor proposition. It's called the fallacy of the illicit major. If it's the major term that gets an upgrade, it's called the fallacy of the illicit minor if it's the minor term that gets the upgrade. All right, so how does this work with some actual examples? All girls are humans, no boys are girls. Therefore, no boys are humans. Does this have 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice? Yes. Does it have a middle term that's distributed at least once? Well, what is our middle term? Our middle term is girls, and it's distributed in the major premise because it's the subject of the A proposition, and it's distributed in the minor premise because it is the predicate of an E proposition. So yeah, girls is distributed twice. There's no problem with that. Is either term distributed in the conclusion? Yeah, both are distributed in the conclusion. And are those both distributed up top? Oh, no. Boys, which is distributed in the conclusion, is also distributed in the premises. But humans, which is distributed in the conclusion, is not distributed in the major premise because humans in the proposition, all girls are humans, is undistributed. So here we have an upgrade. We have the fallacy of the illicit major because the major term, humans, is undistributed in the premises and distributed in the conclusion. All right, how about this one? All Girl Scouts sell cookies. All girls eat cookies. Therefore, all girls are Girl Scouts. Rule 1, does this have 3 terms each used twice? Well, there's cookies used twice, but then girls is used twice, and Girl Scouts is used twice, but is cookies? What am I doing wrong? Oh, wait. I have to translate because sell and eat are not the copula. So actually, we don't have cookies used twice. What we have is that which sells cookies and that which eats cookies. Those are different things. So we have 4 terms here. But this is the fallacy of 4 terms. This doesn't work out because we have compared Girl Scouts to cookie sellers, and we've compared girls to cookie eaters. And that doesn't compare them both to the same thing. Okay, let's look at number 3. All Southerners eat grits. No Yankee is a Southerner, therefore no Yankee eats grits. Does this have 3 and only 3 terms? 3 terms, each used twice? Southerner, Yankee, grit eater? Yep, check, that's all good. Does it have a middle term that is distributed at least once? Yeah, Southerners is their middle term. It's distributed actually each time, and in each of the premises has Southerner distributed as the subject of the A proposition in the major term or major premise, and as the predicate of an E proposition in the minor premise. Okay, so what about upgrades? Do we have do we have terms that are distributed in the conclusion? Yep, they're both distributed in the conclusion. Are those terms distributed in the premises? Ooh, so no Yankee eats grits. No Yankee is a grits eater. The grits eater is distributed in the conclusion, but it is not distributed in that major premise. All Southerners are grits eaters. That's going to make grits eaters the predicate of the major premise. Predicate of an A proposition is undistributed. So we have an upgrade. We have grits eater that got an upgrade from the premises to the conclusion. That will be the fallacy of the illicit major. How about this one? All boojums are snarks. No snarks are jabberwocks. Therefore, no jabberwocks are boojums. Do we have 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice? Yep, jabberwocks twice, snarks twice, boojums twice. Do we have the middle term distributed at least once? Well, our middle term is snarks, and that is distributed in the minor premise. It's not distributed in the major premise, but that's okay. It only needs to be distributed once. So there's no violation of Rule 2 here. That seems to be fine. And now, do we have any terms in the conclusion that are distributed which are undistributed in the premises? Let's see. Jabberwocks is distributed in the conclusion and is distributed in the minor premise. That's fine. And boojums is distributed in the conclusion and is also distributed in the major premise. That's fine. So at least as far as the first 3 rules are concerned, this 4th syllogism on this page is entirely valid. We're good on this one. We're going to leave it right there for now, and I'll be back next time with part 2 of section 7.3, where we'll cover 2 more rules and also some corollaries.